YouTube stream. So less interaction, at least wider audience. Okay, shall I start? Yeah, okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today, we're very happy and very lucky to be able to have Professor Kunal with us. Some of you may attended today's sadly lecture, but some of you may not due to classes and so on. So we're very grateful that Professor Sen is able to give 2 lectures in a day, also sleep deprived. So we'll be very lucky for your knowledge shared today. So just a brief introduction. Professor Kunal Sen is the director of United Nations University of World Institute for Development Economics Research. He's also the professor of development economics at University of Manchester, part of ESA, and also Rao Chair Professor at Institute of Social and Economic Change. So today we have Professor Sen to deliver a lecture about one of his recent paper with Tania Massi and Antonio Savoia, which is published at the World Development this year on fiscal resource curves. So many of our students here also in the graduate program, I told them that they should ask questions. So at least we will expect some questions. So how we will do it, please feel free to deliver what. Okay, good. So if you have any clarifying questions, please just raise your hand. But after that, then we can always have Q&A. Okay, sure. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, so as you know, I am sleep deprived, but when I see all of you, somehow sleep is now the last thing in my mind. So that's really good news because and so it's very good to be here. Before I start, can I do a quick survey here? How many of you are doing a master's? Put your hand up. Master's? Master's? No one. PhD? Everyone. Sorry, no, wait. Master's? Yes. Okay, and PhD? No, wait a minute. You can't be. It has to be a number. So either you're doing a master's or a PhD. Is there any other degree I've forgotten? Okay. Right, the third category. Okay, but all economics, right? Yeah, okay, it's all economics. So because of the variation in terms of master's, PhD, and faculty, so I'll try to keep it as as simple as possible. I'm not going to. This is not a seminar. I'm not presenting a paper. I will present something which was asked to, but I will not really present it like a seminar because that's not the point. It's already published, this paper. So I'll just use it as a way to think about research processes and, how do you get into reasonably good journals and what happened in between, all the bad things that one has to go through when you go through a process of reviewing, so all of that. So I'm going to make it more like interactive, but I'll have to first tell you about the paper because otherwise it's very difficult to have this discussion. So I will take you through the paper very quickly and then we can have more interactions also. And if you want me to ask about other papers that I've been working on, you can, hopefully you've seen some of my other papers. If you have, then you're welcome to ask me a question on my other paper, including papers you haven't published as yet. But yeah, this is not a seminar. I'm not presenting a paper which is still ongoing. It's not that I'm presenting a paper which I want to get feedback on. It's too late now for that. Okay, but it's more about what happened in the process of trying to get this paper published. Okay, so that's just to make it clear. But also, I'm quite keen to hear about your own challenges, struggles, whatever, with your own publication process. What have you been learning, especially those who are early faculty here or doing a PhD? What do you think you want to know more about? Because given my age, I'm pretty experienced now with many things to do with supervision. I've had now about 30 PhD students, maybe even more actually, over the last several years. And also I have examined and including on PhD in Indonesia actually, and also obviously gone through a lot of peer reviewing processes. So if you want me to sound out some issues that you're facing with your publications or the research topics or questions that you think you want to know more about, I think this is the whole point, right? This discussion, okay? So, all right. So let me talk about this particular paper. I think I'll try to get some coffee. Where's the coffee water? Okay. This is just to be sure that I don't fall asleep. So I'm very, like I said, very pleased to be here. I don't think I have been to this campus in Indonesia, University of Indonesia. I might have been earlier wherever it was located before. I was telling today in the morning, the first time I came here was in 1992. So it's been quite a long time, quite a long time. So, okay. So this paper came out earlier this year. This paper is called, Is There a Fiscal Resource Curse? Resource Rents, Fiscal Capacity, and Political Institutions in Developing Countries. It's co-authored with Tania Masi, who's in University in Italy, and Antonio Savoia, who's in University of Manchester, where I have affiliation still. So it's two other co-authors. Now, what I want to do is use the paper first to think about some ideas that might be relevant for you around political institutions, resource curse, a very important issue in Indonesia, obviously, and also fiscal capacity. And I was saying to Rusan that when I put the slides together in a paper, I was so busy with so many things, including preparing for the Sabdi lecture, I'd forgotten, and that in this paper, I have an Indonesia-Nigeria comparison. I'd totally forgotten. And then when I looked at this slide here, I said, oh my God, how did that happen? Okay. So anyway, I'll get to that comparison in a few minutes. That was purely by coincidence. It was not planned. Right. So basically, this paper was trying to do something that I have been struggling with for some time. So I'm an economist, but I have an interest in economy, and I'm always interested in questions that straddles the economics, institutions, political science space. So I do read a lot of political science because I find they're very relevant. Also, including papers which are qualitative papers, not quantitative papers, but I always find that they are still very useful for me. That's something I would tell you, that you need to be always open to new things, and new disciplines and new approaches, because you can always learn, right? That's very important. So in this paper, the main thing that we were looking at is an issue that really interesting. When I was in Bapinas yesterday, and I'm discussion with colleagues in Bapinas, one of the things that I learned in Indonesia is that tax over GDP is a measure of fiscal capacity, not the best measure, but a reasonably good measure. The tax over GDP is flatlined around 10% of GDP. 10% GDP is not very high, which is surprising because when you have economic growth, tax over GDP tends to rise. It's called the buoyancy of tax revenues. Growth leads to more tax being collected, people are richer. But in Indonesia, that's not happened, right? Now, that's a puzzle, of course, and there's a really interesting research question, why hasn't that happened? Now, and I don't want to get into what the answer to that is, but then that is an important measure of fiscal capacity. Why is it an important measure? Well, if the government has to spend money on education, on health, social protection, whatever they want to do for their citizens, especially the ones who are more vulnerable, they need to have tax revenues to finance that. Today's world, you just can't go and borrow in the world markets and finance your deficit. That actually Indonesia did at a point in time in 1990, so it was a very, very costly situation. So no government wants to do that. They don't want to finance their expenditures by borrowing either from domestic markets or from international markets. But generally, you try to make sure that your tax over GDP is sufficiently high that it can finance all the education, health, and social protection expenditures that the government wants to do, very rightly. So in Indonesia, there's this problem, which is interesting, and I think I'll show you that actually it's not been a problem perhaps so much in the past. So the capacity to collect revenues is the heart of state formation. If you look at the history of Western states, European states in particular, you'll see that when they started collecting taxes, that's when the state became more capable. Why? Because it's not easy to collect taxes, right? You got to have a good capacity of administrative capacity that your tax authority can go and see who's supposed to pay taxes, either for the corporation income tax, or the personal income tax. So the history of taxation is completely linked with the history of state formation. And that's one of the things we now know about why Western countries have been able to develop, because they invested a lot in their fiscal or taxation capacity. In fact, there is an argument that the personal income tax, introduction of personal income tax, is a first step towards state formation. Why? Because imagine a state that's trying to raise revenue, and they need to say how can they raise revenue. Of course, they can use VAT, GST, and so on. When they go and tax the citizens and say you got to pay income taxes, that's the first time when they interact with the citizen in such a way the citizen says, okay, I'm going to give you something from my income as a personal income tax. What am I going to get in return? Why should I give you this income tax? And then the state says, okay, if you give us this personal income tax, you're going to get better schools for your kids, better health care for yourself, maybe even you might get something in terms of social welfare benefits. So the citizen says, okay, that's a good idea. I'm going to pay a tax, right? This particular two-way relationship is not easy to do. It's actually quite difficult. In Africa, it's been a major problem because citizens say, well, what am I really going to get in return? Am I going to get good schools for my kids? Am I going to get better hospitals? Probably not. So then there's a problem that the state cannot collect income tax if people are evading the state. So that first introduction of personal income tax is often a marker of the state is beginning to develop capacity. So that's something just to keep in mind, okay? So, and the problem then is that if you're a resource-rich economy, resource-rich country, which Indonesia has been for a long time, then actually there's a problem, even bigger problem. Because if the rulers know there is this windfall, oil windfall, or any other minerals they can get revenue from, why would the state or the government invest in a tax system when there's an easy way to get money by essentially trying to get the money from the resources itself? And one of the arguments people make is what is called the fiscal resource curse. The greater the expected amount of income from natural resources, the greater incentive to substitute tax revenues for resource revenues and lower the fiscal capacity. So when countries go through the resource booms, oil prices increase and so on, copper prices, whichever prices of minerals, then you see usually the state is beginning to tax less because the state now has other way of raising revenue, right? What we argue in this paper, this particular argument, the fiscal resource curse, is well understood. There are many examples of this in the world. Many resource-rich countries where they have an ability to develop taxation capacity. But what we wanted to say here, that actually that argument is not so obvious. Because if there is a state where the political institutions are such they can limit the power of the executive to tax or to expropriate the resource revenues, then actually it's not obvious that any resource-rich economy will always then underinvest in taxation fiscal capacity when there's a resource boom. And so if you think about examples around the world, perhaps the best example is Norway. Okay, it's a rich country and it's in Europe. But Norway has seen quite remarkable increase in oil revenues, oil and gas, and they have not in any way altered their incentive to have high taxation. Norway has one of the highest taxation, taxable GDP ratio in the world. Norway is an example. The other example, not as clear as Norway, is perhaps in the Middle East, UAE, also at Dubai, and Abu Dhabi now, before Dubai, also had a lot of oil revenues, and they also invested in the state, in taxation capacity. But of course, then you look around, there are many other examples where you have exactly the opposite issue. Nigeria, of course, I'll talk about. There are many other countries in Africa, particularly, where when we see resource booms, the state starts taxing less. So actually, if anything, there are more examples where the resource curse is present than when it's not present. So then the question is, why is that the case? Why do we see that? Okay, now, okay, so this was the, this is the Indonesia-Nigeria comparison. And when we were writing, okay, so this is where I need to tell you a bit about the paper. So when we were writing this paper, and I'll tell you exactly the history and sequence of when the paper was submitted to the journal and what happened and so on, that I'll tell you later. But let me just tell you that when we submitted the paper to World Development, in the first round of referees that we got, they want two things they said. Our paper was a multi-country panel data analysis, like all economists do. Lots of countries, lots of years, panel data analysis, standard two-way fixed effects. So, it was panel data analysis, and we did a lot of robustness tests and so on, as you have to do always, as usual. But the referees wanted two things. One, they said that you have to have a sharper theory. So what's your theoretical framework? So we had to think about the theory, and I'll tell you about the theory in a few minutes. Second is they said, it's like, okay, it's nice to have this panel data analysis, but like, you're not telling a story about countries here. And you want to tell us a little bit about like, okay, can you give us some country examples of what might have happened in one country and not in another country? Then we, of course, had to look around because economists are not good at country case studies, right? So we were like, okay, what do we do now? And then we found this wonderful book by Peter Lewis called Growing Apart, Oil, Politics, and Economic Change in Indonesia and Nigeria. It's now a bit outdated, but it's an amazing book. It's still so readable, so important for Indonesia. So in this book, we found a story which we could take as an example of our country case studies. And the argument that Peter Lewis makes, this is not our argument, it's Peter Lewis's argument, the Indonesia and Nigeria are both populous countries, of course, very large populations, culturally diverse communities, obvious. Both are major oil exporters, obvious. But after the OPEC-inspired oil price hikes in 1974, the oil boom in Indonesia, we all know, we know that very well. Both countries experienced large windfalls from oil in the same period. Huge revenue increases. Indonesia, as you know, huge increase in revenue. And both at that time, and for some time, even after that, had authoritarian regimes. Of course, we know that too, right? And for much of that, it's because both countries' democracy came much later, right? So these are the two countries, both the populous countries, both having diverse populations, both having this oil price boom, right? You should expect both these countries to have similar outcomes with tax revenues, but that was not the case. When we look at their tax revenues at that time, we find that, so non-resource taxes, not taxes on resources, obviously. We find that actually, in the case of Nigeria, the red, non-resource taxes did not increase as much, but for Indonesia, especially from 1990 onwards, we see a big increase in non-resource taxes. So the oil price boom, actually, the oil price boom in Indonesia, many of you probably know this because there's a lot of good literature on this. In the morning I was mentioning Hal Hill's book. He talks a lot about this in his book. So in Indonesia, what happened, and I'm just saying this just because I think it's all obvious, but I just want to make sure everybody knows the story, that in Indonesia, the oil price boom did not lead to a resource windfall. The state, and that time it was generally in the Suharto regime, two things happened. They used the oil revenues for a major increase in education infrastructure. Lots of schools are built. Major school building program, right? So, of course, school building means human capital formation, right? So there was not money spent on, unproductive activities, as usually happens. There was a genuine attempt to use oil revenues for human capital formation. And we know subsequently how important that was. There's been very, very good work on this, including by the Nobel laureate Esther Duflo, her first paper was on this issue, actually. And she looks at this question of how that affected school building and affects on children's education and so on. And the second thing they did was to invest in fiscal capacity, taxation capacity. So that was what Indonesia did with the oil windfall, but not Nigeria. And therefore, we see these big differences between these two countries in terms of non-resource taxes, right? So then you might ask the question, what happened then? Why was there a difference in these two countries? And we then said, well, the one difference that was there was a difference in level of constraints to the executive in these two countries. What do I mean by that? So both had authoritarian regimes, of course, we know that. But in fact, in Nigeria have been a succession of military rulers. In Nigeria, democracy has been very difficult in Nigeria more recently. What happened was in Suharto's time, and again, I'm talking to some people who should know this history. In Suharto's time, there were a lot of checks and balances at that time, maybe not later. In the 1990s, things changed, right? We know that. At that time, there were a lot of checks and balances on Suharto's authority. There were others, technocrats and others, including, of course, Professor Mohan Sadli, were also very involved. So there was a limit to what the dictator could do as such. In Nigeria, that was not the case. So the difference between these two countries was really to do with political institutions that were very different from in these two countries. And we argue that that's the reason that, just to get the full slide back. So we argue that that's the reason why Indonesia did not suffer the fiscal resource curse while Nigeria did. And just to now make this in a cross-country simple scatters here. So if you look at this diagram here, the richer you are by resources, you can see non-resource taxes are falling. Negative scatter is very clear, right? This is the fiscal resource curve. The richer your resources are, you're putting less incentive in taxing your citizens, okay? But then when you look at this here, you see that actually this negative scatter depends on the constraints on the executive, the checks and balances on the executive, the ruler, right? So the first scatter here on that is negative is when we have very weak constraints on the executive. These are countries where, like a Nigeria example. While the one that you see a flatter line is where they're quite strong constraints. So then you start thinking, okay, maybe then the relationship between resource wealth and fiscal capacity measured by non-resource taxes over GDP is something that is not unconditional, it's conditional on the level of political institutions. Stronger political institutions, less likely you'll have a fiscal resource curse if resource wealth increases because of a commodity price boom. And you can see that because the second scatter, the black one, it's not very mildly negative. It's not even really strongly negative, right? So if you use the scatter right away, you can see there's something going on here, which now we need to investigate more systematically, right? Obviously, these are scatters. These are not causal, right? So then we started thinking more carefully, and this is where the referee said, think of the theoretical framework, tell us exactly why you think resources why we may not see a fiscal resource curse with stronger political institutions. And then we started thinking, okay, does it depend on the nature of the resource itself? That some resources is more likely to see a resource curse, and some resources we are not likely to see resource curses. So that was the first thing. And also along with that, whether countries have strong political institutions, they limit the power of the executive, right? So we're going to look at these two things, develop testable hypothesis from using theory building. So this paper has a theory section, relatively light, nothing formal, no equations, but relatively light. But trying to develop a theoretical framework that can explain whether or not you see fiscal resource curse depends on number one, politics. Number two, the type of resources the country has, okay? So, and of course, when we looked around the literature, we found there was some good case study evidence, mostly from political scientists and historians on this. And the argument they were making in their case studies, not economics, these are historians and political scientists, was that if you don't have, so if you have a counter mechanism for state leadership, then the incentive that state leaderships have to use resource rents in a bad way, like patronage, for example, giving jobs to your favorite people among your family or friends, less likely that you can do that. So when you have checks and balances, a ruler has less discretion over public finance decisions. And that's pretty obvious, right? Imagine that you have a person who is the leader, the dictator. There are no veto powers in the system. There are no one else who can say you can't do this. Of course, then give incentive to then use resource rents for your own ends or your own group's ends, kinship and so on. But when you have some kind of checks and balances, you're going to be a bit more careful, and then the political leaders operating under a system checks and balances subject to the scrutiny of public finance institutions. So imagine then you're in a country where there are strong courts, strong legal systems, strong third-party institutions which check whether you're corrupt or not, strong anti-corruption mechanisms. In those kind of countries, there's checks and balances happening both maybe within the country itself, or within the parliament itself, the strong parliament, strong opposition, or it could be outside the parliament, outside the political institutions, in terms of third-party institutions like, I said, courts and so on. So where you see that, then in fact, you're not going to see leaders using resource rents for their own particular political purposes and patronage reasons. So case studies from African and Latin America confirm the emergence of a natural resource sector is not incompatible with the development state institutions, depending on the type of political coalitions ruling during a resource boom. This is an important argument because there is a view that the resource curse is inevitable. You have to suffer it. So there's a view that if you're resource rich, that's tough luck, you're going to be in a bad situation. That view is very much there, and of course, many countries will say, well, what can we do? That's the nature of the politics in this country. What are you going to say that not really? That's not really the case. And we can find that from case study evidence from Africa and Latin America, and for the scatter that I showed you earlier, scatter diagram I showed you earlier, okay? So Now, the next part of the argument. Why is it that some natural resources are more likely to be appropriated by the state or the leaders? Are they different? Are natural resources different in some way? And if so, what exactly are they, right? And that's when we started thinking more the theoretical building, theory building side, looked at other literature, and we argued that what is really important is, are the resources extracted from a narrow geographical base, which we call point source resources, because once you have it from one place, it's easier to appropriate the resources, or are they from a broad geographical base, which we call diffuse natural resources, which are less easy to control and less prone to incentivize substitution. So let's take an example, two kinds of natural resources, okay? So Indonesia actually has both. Think about oil. Oil can only be drilled and found in certain areas. Oil is not available everywhere, right? Oil, we know oil fields are very concentrated in particular areas. That's an example of a point source resource. Think about forests. Forests are natural resources. They are spread around, they're large areas, they are difficult to control and difficult for a ruler to try to appropriate resources from forest lands. So that's an example of where we can call forests as being diffuse resource and oil being a point source resource. And the question is, does it really matter which country has what in terms of the resource curves, okay? So we're using that. And again, using literature from political science and so on, I won't get too much into that, and arguing that the big problem is not with diffuse natural resources, the big problem is with point source resources. That's where the resource curves can happen, and that's why political solutions can make a big difference. So just very quickly, I'm not going to go to the econometrics here, but just for you to understand, we use panel data for 62 developing countries. We measured fiscal capacity, non-resource tax on income and profit, capital gains, over total tax revenues, standard measure of fiscal capacity. You can easily get that from available data. The resource rent, you use the share of national capital wealth over total wealth, using the wealth accounting data set. Again, resource rents you can measure in many different ways. You can look at oil rents, you can look at other rents. So, there's a literature on this. So how do you measure rents? So use this measure. We, of course, use some other measures, just like the robustness test, and you didn't find much difference. The political institutions data we got from Polity4. Polity4 does give you data on executive constraints. Now we also have a new data set called VDEM, which also has that. At that time, we didn't have access to VDEM, so we got it from the political science database. Again, it's important to understand that when you're doing a PhD thesis or when you're looking at ideas or papers, you need to look around for data sets which are not standard economic data sets, because there's a lot of good political science data coming out which are now quantitative data. So there's a lot of things that are coming in political science which economists like us can use. So that was something else. Now, so again, just marginal effect. I'm not going to present. I just want to show you the thing. So what you see here clearly that resource wealth overall, there's no story. Diffuse resources, no story. The point source resources, the stronger are executive constraints, the marginal effect is stronger on fiscal capacity. So if your executive constraint is like 0, actually you're in negative space. And you get to like 6, you're hugely positive space. And you also look at the upper and lower bound. What it's saying is that a country like, say, okay, maybe Nigeria is not 0, but anyway, it's quite low. When you see an oil price boom, very likely that you will have no increase or maybe negative on tax or GDP, not just tax GDP. If you're a country like a Norway, which is probably the highest end of this, then when oil prices increase, actually, if anything, there's investment in tax capacity. Okay, so that is the story here, and it's very interesting that the marginal effect plot on diffuse resources pretty much aggregate null effects, 0 effects. But for point source resources, it's a very positive effect. Okay, so that's one important thing that I think. And then this is again to show you that if we do it by different resources, the clear story is on this one here, oil. Oil is a big story. Oil is a particular kind of resource which is very, very easy to capture by the elites. Very easy to capture. So geographically concentrated, so easy to capture, right? And that's why countries which are oil producing, oil-rich countries, have had this problem of resource scarce. More than any other resource, and you can see the other resources here, there's really not much of a story. The gas is also there. Gas is also a little bit like coal, but yeah. So if you look at, I'm sorry, I'll go back again. If you look at agricultural wealth, forest wealth, mineral wealth, not much story. Oil is the big thing, and Indonesia has oil, right? And of course, then the question is, why has Indonesia not seen the resource curse as much as it could have, right? Now, when you do this thing, okay, so first time we did this, we set the paper back. Referees were okay, said, yeah, okay, you got a nice case study here, but that's not enough for us because it has to be causal. And parallel data econometrics, unfortunately, I don't know how many of you do parallel data econometrics here. Parallel data econometrics, though it's very nice and very convenient, because you have this cross-country data set you can use, if you send it to a pretty good journal, it's going to be difficult convincing them that the paper is causal, okay? Now, I know the tendency, and I've been examining so many PhD dissertations, everybody goes and has running GMM methods, generalized method of moments methods. Now, GMM methods, now when I'm examining a PhD, I think, okay, maybe it's fine. I'm not going to get too worried. But if this paper has to go to a journal and I'm a journal referee, I'm going to say no, right? Because GMM methods are like a black box. You're chucking things into this method, not really understanding what's happening. And I think, I mean, they are useful, but you need to do something else along with that. You can't just do that and say, okay, the director will be happy with what we did, right? So therefore, they came back and said, no, parallel data is fine, but, the case study you have is a nice case study, or, Nigeria and Indonesia, nice case study, no problem with that, but is it really costly? We were like, okay, what do we do now? After all the work we did in putting together this case study and the theoretical part that we had to spend a lot of time on. Luckily, one of my co-authors, Tanya Masi, this is the good thing of working with younger people, because I'm not at all in that space anymore. She said, oh, you know what? I can do synthetic DID, synthetic difference in difference. I was like, synthetic difference in difference? What on earth is that? I've heard of difference in difference, and I understand difference in difference. Then you can ask, if you want me to ask a question on difference, I can answer that. But synthetic difference in difference? And then I, spent some time to understand, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Because synthetic difference in difference can be applied to the Indonesia and Nigeria story so well. Because in synthetic difference in difference, you take two countries which are going through similar exogenous shocks, like oil price increases. But they differ in something, in this case, exotic constraints. And then you have the control, which is the one which has no resources, so oil price increases don't do anything to those countries. And the treated countries are Indonesia and Nigeria. And it's synthetic because the control countries are completely synthetic, right? You create a synthetic control from these other countries. And then you do this treatment on Nigeria and Indonesia, with the only difference being their different political institutions, and then you can see the difference and see whether you actually get a positive story for Indonesia compared to Nigeria. And I said, wow, thank God that I had a very, very bright co-author with me who knows all these things, because if it was me, I would have completely not done anything to do about it. So she said, okay, let's do something different. So what is that? Let me explain to you, because these are things that nowadays, the way things are going, we have to keep on investing on all these things. You got to keep on spending time reading all these new papers coming out, understanding this causal experimental literature. So the synthetic DID was provided by somebody called Argankelski et al. 2021. It's a recent technique, actually. So we're using a natural experiment, right? The oil price boom that happened in Indonesia and elsewhere, the resource boom that happened here. So that's our natural experiment. Then we are combining difference in difference with synthetic control methods. That's why synthetic DID, right? So it allows a neat comparison between contexts of high and low executive constraints by producing country-specific evidence for those oil-rich economies that display different levels of executive constraints, right? And we, of course, focus on the effect of non-resource taxes. As I said, that's a dependent variable. And then the controls are a sample of resource-poor countries following the oil price boom. So let's be clear. The treatment is the oil price boom. That's a natural experiment, totally exogenous, right? Control are countries which don't have resources, oil resources. Treated countries are the countries which have oil resources, here in this case, Nigeria and Indonesia. And the difference in the two countries is the difference in executive constraints. So if you do that, what do we find? You find that exactly as we predicted, in Nigeria, the control is the blue line, so there's nothing happening to the control countries. Indonesia, what happens is, after the oil price boom, there is further investment in fiscal capacity, in other words, non-resource taxes, just as had happened in the 1970s. So non-resource taxes, the green line, this is Indonesia, goes up. So the countries using the oil price boom to invest more in better tax administration and bureaucracy and so on. Nigeria, just opposite, right? And this graph, this itself was enough for us. Once we had this graph, I knew that newspaper is going to get accepted. It was like pretty obvious to me, because this is telling a story that we were trying to tell through the case studies, which is nice, the case study comparison is nice, but now in a way that economists can understand, right? And so when we produce this, when Dani produces graphs and we produce the estimates, we put it in the appendix estimates because the estimates were not so relevant. The graph was very nice. And then you can see here, the average treatment ATT is positive, not positive, it's positive but not significant, but for Nigeria, it's negative and significant. And here, this is the non-resource tax over GDP. So in Nigeria, this oil price boom leads to a decline in tax over GDP, non-resource tax over GDP, but not in Indonesia, right? So once we did that, we could now go to the conclusions. Points of resource are negatively associated with fiscal capacity, while diffuse resources are not. That we already saw earlier. Political institutions that are placing constraints on the executive can neutralize a negative effect of point resources and fiscal capacity. We saw that in Indonesia and not in Nigeria. And of course, it means that if you are going to avoid the resource curse doesn't have to happen. That was our policy finding. It is up to the state to develop institutions that can limit its power effectively, right? And if you can do that, then you can develop fiscal capacity and natural resource sector without any trade-off. That was a big policy finding we did. And in the paper, we got a policy block, a lot of traction on the policy side. When I write a paper, I try to write a blog also along with it. I find the blog gets me a lot of readership for the paper, so I generally try to put an 800-word blog together, publish it somewhere, and I find that very useful, and I think useful for you also. It doesn't take too much time to write a blog, a few hours maybe, but I think it helps me to publicize the paper very well. So, but if you think about the process of this paper, right? We submitted this paper in 2022 to World Development, and it's not like it's American Economic Review, right? I mean, it's a good journal, but it's not American Economic Review. So first decision, and this is the problem nowadays that you have to face. First decision was in September 2022, so it's probably 6 months after submission. That first decision was, where's the theory and where are the case studies? Okay, we go back, and then we work on it, spend a lot of time on the case studies and the theory. Second decision, we submit, and then in March 2023, you get a second R&R. I mean, we had thought, okay, first R&R, hopefully we'll get through. No, second R&R. That's when we had to now show the causal evidence, the synthetic DID. Go back again, do the synthetic DID. That's mostly Tanya now doing this. Third decision now is a minor revision, some references they wanted something, but that was quite minor actually. We knew pretty much we were now close to the end when we got the minor revision, and then we resubmitted in late December 2023, and you got the paper after January 2024. So, how long did it take for this paper to come out from start to finish? 2 whole years. That's a lot of years, a lot of time in your own lives. 2 whole years. Okay. So now I'm not saying this is the case for every journal or every paper, but one of the things I think I've learned also. And I have to say, in this case, with Tanya's relatively early career researcher, she just finished a PhD a few years back, is that, if I'm an early career researcher and I see this R&R second time around, I say, I'm giving up. This is not working. I'm not going to do it anymore. Maybe I'll go to some other journal or something like that. And that's when my experience comes in. I say, look, you got the R&R, right? You got a fit in your door, the door. The door has not been shut on you. You have this foot. It's up to you to open up the door now, right? And if you don't take this option and you say, I've had this referees and this journal, I'm going somewhere else, then the next time around, there won't even be this foot at the door. The door will be totally shut on you. And you're going to regret the first decision that you decided to get out of the earlier journal where you had a possibility. So I always tell to my earlier career, I have a lot of my co-authors are now much younger than me, I would say. I always tell them, look, patience is a virtue. You've got to be patient. Now, sometimes it doesn't work out. I'll be honest. Sometimes when you are in that situation, third time around, the referees can say, sorry, we are not buying this anymore. You're going to reject your paper. That happens. I've gone through that myself. But I do think that one of the things that is not very true in our profession, economics especially, is it takes a long time to get papers through. Referees take a long time to send comments. Editors take a long time to make decisions. Everything is slowed down so much, right? Especially journals like World Development, you get lots of papers. So what can you do? That's the world that you're facing, right? But we have to have these papers. And for Tanya, this publication was very important for her tenure, for her own career progression, maybe more than for me. So you have to keep on being very, very persistent, right? So that's one lesson one learns. Second lesson one learns is that, so what happened here, we didn't hear from the editor for a long time. And we thought that, okay, the editor has forgotten about us. And my co-author was saying, okay, forget about it. Maybe you shouldn't remind the editor. I said, no, we should. The editor has a professional duty to make sure the paper has been sent to referees and make sure the referees are sending the comments back in time. So, of course, that I had to do myself because I was the senior most author in this. So I wrote to the editor and said, sorry, but we haven't heard from you. What happened? I mean, I wrote in a very polite way, of course. I didn't want to get the editor angry with me, but I said a polite way, what's happened, right? And in fact, in that case, the editor said, no, actually, I'm going to follow up. And that's also important to understand. Everybody's busy these days. We have to also understand, if I was in that situation, looking after many papers as editor of a journal, sometimes I would forget about specific papers. So there is no harm in reminding editors if your paper is stuck for some time, not like just in like 1-2 months, maybe a bit longer, I would say. 6 months is the kind of average, I would say, or 3 to 4 months at least. But you need to do that. You need to do that in a friendly way, because the last thing you want to do is get anybody upset, right? That's not the point. So I think from this paper, I just want to make this point that one of the things that is happening now is the more you can make sure you cover every possible base. In this paper, when it was first sent, it was panel data analysis, interesting results. It didn't have the theory, it didn't have the case studies. Then we sent it back. The case studies were there, the theory was there, not good enough. And then you have to provide the causal evidence, right? So now you have to cover all these bases. You have to have some kind of a theorizing, or to have some kind of reasonably good panel data economics if you're using panel data, or if you're using microdata, that's fine. And I think you have to have some causal identification. I don't know how many of you are using causal identification in your work, but it is difficult now. Even a journal World Development, which 5 years back, they would never worry about this. Things are changing, So how to then invest in causal identification strategies, I hope you all are familiar with it here. It's very, very important. And using it in a nice way, because just because you have to learn the difference when you apply it, that's not the point. You have to use it in a nice way. You have to always understand what you're doing with it, right? So I think that's a lesson I learned from this particular, from this whole experience. And I learned something. I learned about a new technique that I never knew about. I never knew what synthetic DID before. I knew what synthetic control methods. I knew what DID, that I knew for a long time. But I didn't know about synthetic DID. So I ended up saying to my co-author, Tanya, I said, wow, you taught me something today. I would have never known about it. Now I'm waiting for another paper to use this method. So that's when you really learn the new method. You say, okay, where do I use this next, right? So I think you can always learn from this process of submitting, resubmitting, working with other people with different skill sets. It's so important in economics now. You can't work on your own these days. Things are so difficult to publish without using others, just collectively bringing your skills together. So I think all of these things are important in the publication process. And I hope that many of the things I'm saying you already are thinking about doing. But if not, or if you have any questions, let's cover, and maybe if any question about, like, not so much the paper itself, the findings are already, obviously the paper's published, but more about the process itself and other experiences that I might have had on other papers that I've done, which are coming out recently. So not just example of this paper, there are other examples of other papers that I've also gone through, different experience. Not every experience you do is the same, right? Things are different journals. So let's have a discussion on this now, so I can then take a bit of a rest and not speak. Yeah. So anyone to ask on?
Up to you. You can rest a bit. Thank you so much, Professor Sen. So, any questions? Let me just open the floor, maybe. Someone suggested that I should get one from each side of the room. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kunal. My name is Kuku, and I'm a master student in economic science. Maybe I want to ask the condition in the country that can maintain the GDP, but they still have a great natural resources, such as, let's say, Australia, the nearest from Indonesia. So I want to ask what kind of institution in Australia that fit or suit in their country so they can maintain their GDP and they have a high of natural resources. So the natural resources course is not happen in Australia. And then is there any relationship with the colony came in our country? I mean, like, the colony, Australia has a past with English, and us with, we have a relationship with Netherlands. Is there any relationship with the colony come in our country at first? So, thank you. Or any other explain, maybe in your article, you said that if different natural resources have a different effect. Okay, thank you.
Actually, the second question, I don't know if you really, I mean, it's one of the most biggest questions right now. The second question you asked, which I'll rephrase for you, is one of the biggest questions right now in the literature institutions and development. This question you asked, which I'll rephrase for everybody here, the benefit of that, you asked the question that Australia is not exactly a colony like Indonesia was with the Dutch, or India was with England, Great Britain, or Latin America was with Spain. So what's different from Australia versus Indonesia or any other countries which have been colonized by the colonizers, right? This question actually led to a paper which is probably now the highest Google Scholar cited paper. I was checking the other day. I forget the exact number. It's one of the most cited papers there is in economics. Can you guess which paper is this? AGR. AGR. You should know what. Okay. You do? Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I actually teach AJR. This is a paper by Asemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, AER 2001, American Economic Review 2001. And this is one of my favorite papers to teach. Because when I teach, I like papers which are really like out of the ordinary papers. So this paper makes an argument, it's a controversial argument. I'm not trying to defend the argument. The argument they make is that the difference between Australia and Indonesia, very bluntly, okay, is in Australia the colonizers settled in that Australia. So mostly the British settlers, the British colonizers settled in Australia because the weather was nice. There was not a fear of dying, no diseases. So disease rates were low in Australia. So of course colonizers felt like this is a nice place to settle, and they settled. So they have settled in Australia, they settled in New Zealand, settled in the United States also, same thing. But they did not settle in Indonesia, the Dutch I mean, and they did not settle in India, they didn't settle in Africa and so on. Because in this country, disease environment was high, and they were fearing that they might die. So what the paper does, it constructs, so again, econometrics in this paper is instrumental variable estimation, which nowadays people think it's too simple, but sometimes you have very nice instrumental variable estimation. So what they use is the settler mortality rate, so the disease environment, how many settlers die, basically. So number of people dying in Australia, number of people dying in Indonesia and so on. So they have a historian's work, Philip Curtin's work, who has computed this mortality rates for settlers many years back, right? So they use that to say this instrument, this variable, is an instrumental variable because it explains where colonizers settled. And then when they settled, they brought in good institutions, and when they didn't settle, they brought in bad institutions, right? And therefore, those bad institutions led to bad economic development outcomes, and the good institutions led to good economic outcomes, basically better institutional quality. So what they do then is they show that, that settler mortality rate is a good instrument for the disease environment, shows then where settlers resided, located, explains the quality of institutions at that time, they have some measure of that, and then explains now the quality of institutions today. And that quality institution today explains GDP growth today. So what is it saying? It's saying, in a way, this paper is about a very smart instrumental variable strategy. That's what it is. Very, very smart, very, very smart. To use economic historians' data in this way, it's no wonder this paper is so well cited, right? But at the same time, this paper is telling us something which is quite unpleasant for us to think about, especially for people like us, meaning when I say us, I mean I'm from India, you're from Indonesia, we are lived in countries which have been colonized. The argument is problematic because it's saying that, okay, the settlers have gone, countries are independent, right? After independence, things should have changed, but they didn't. Institutions that were bad, institutions then are still bad now. So there must have been some logic in post-independent colonial economies that those bad institutions were not changed for bad institutions, just to make it very simple, right? So currently, if you have these bad institutions in these countries, which are formerly called colonies, then you can't blame the settlers, the colonizers as much. You could still blame them because they brought the bad institutions in, of course, but you also have to then say that current rulers are also responsible for not bringing in more inclusive institutions. So I always use this paper as an example of showing that, the world is not black or white, if you believe this argument. I'm not trying to say you have to. If you believe the argument, it's not black or white. It's not the colonizers are responsible only, and it's not that they are not at all responsible, because, of course, they did bring in the bad institutions, but also political elites who came into these countries, newly independent countries, also did not have much of an incentive to change institutions which are bad because they profited from those institutions too, right? So the Australia example is a very good example because it's telling exactly versus Indonesia, right? Maybe that's what might have happened because Australia hasn't, as you said rightly, hasn't had much problems with its resource wealth. They have had a little bit of business cycles when prices go up of commodities. Of course, they have a boom and commodity prices fall. There's a bit of a recession, but nothing very severe, nothing like what we see in Nigeria, right? So I think these are really interesting country examples, can help us understand bigger theoretical arguments also, and sometimes also helps us think about how to think about innovative empirical strategies, because you have to think about publishing a paper, right? So I think this is a really nice example. And this paper, I do think that it's cited for good reasons, I would say, because it's making a pretty controversial and a pretty important argument. So that's your second question, which I really thought was a great question, actually. The first question, I think, the thing is that I use Norway as an example. But if you think of Norway, right? Norway, every indicator would have said there would be a resource curse. They have had so much of an increase in oil prices, and they've been so blessed with oil and natural gas wealth. But what did they do when they had this increase in oil prices? Two things. One, they put this money into a sovereign wealth fund, which they will not touch. That money in the sovereign wealth fund is going to go to children's education, future generations. So they did not use the money for today's generation, which was the incentive they would have had, They kept the money in sovereign wealth funds, which would be used for future generations of investments, so on, right? At the same time, in Norway, go to Norway, it's a country which has got so much oil and gas. You see only electric cars. Wait a minute, what is going on here, right? But they realize that oil is going to run out. And they're moving into electric motor vehicles in a very big way. Not that it's been that easy also, I would say, because you have to have the charging station and so on. But they have a major, I think they're now probably 90%, I'm not sure complete number, exact number, but pretty much a majority of cars are now electric cars. Can you imagine that in any other resource-rich economy which has oil? Impossible to imagine, because they'll have cheap oil to give out. And why would they then move into electric cars, right? So Norway is an example where I think it shows that if political leaders are forward-looking, and Australia doesn't have the same resource wealth as Norway has. Australia has definitely nowhere near the oil and so on. It's a different kind of commodity structure. It shows that you can think about this. Now, if you look at, say, in Africa, sovereign wealth funds have often been misused. They create that fund, and the next thing you know, a ruler comes along and says, oh, great, I have cash lying around in the bank. I'm going to use it now for whatever I want to do. So that problem of governance of this long-term investment funds is a huge problem in countries which have weak institutions. But Norway avoided that. Of course, you might say Norway is Norway, but yeah, but then why? Why is Norway managed this so well, right? So I think these are important questions. I mean, I would say in Indonesia, and this is just an outsider's view, generally I would say so far, there has been good governance. I mentioned the 1973 oil price boom. Generally, I may be wrong here, and others can speak up if I'm wrong. I would say generally they avoided the problems that we see in many other resource-rich economies. I may be wrong. I don't know what people say here who are more aware of this than I am. But I think generally they have avoided this, both in the 1970s and 2002 too, I would say. The big problem that happened was, of course, 1996. That's a different situation and not to do with resources per se, right? The financial crisis, right? There's a different situation. That we can discuss separately, yeah. But I love your question. Very nice question. Thank you. And you're doing a master's. Oh, wow. Okay. That's really, really good.
More questions, please. Any more questions? Anyone from the doctor's students? And any questions from the doctor's students? I know you had a long day, but you still have questions, I think. Anyone from that side?
Can I ask a question? Who uses
Sure.
causal identification strategies in your thesis? Who's using causal? I hope you know what causal identification is. Yeah? Okay. So who's not using it? Let me put it that way. Who's not using distributed variables? You're not?
Not
Okay.
yet deciding.
Oh, not yet deciding. Okay.
Most of the masters will do some causal estimations. Yeah.
Okay. But maybe you had a question. You can ask.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the thing is, the way I see a dissertation is sometimes since I examine so many PhDs, if the descriptive story is pretty rich, I think that's fine, I don't necessarily think that then I necessarily put the examine and say, okay, this person is failing because this person doesn't have a causal identification. I would say, okay, you did this in your thesis, but now you want to publish, then you got to think about it, right? Because pretty much the chance of getting publication these days in a good journal without causal identification is very difficult, really, in my view, causal identification happens micro or macro also. Macro has a different approach. Macro is more structural macro modeling, and then you do calibration. But whatever you do, whether you do micro or macro, you have to then think about causal identification. But for PhDs, it's fine, because a PhD is your starting process, right? You're just trying to understand some research problem, and if you use good descriptive, not just like just putting some tables, that's not good enough. But if you're using good descriptive methods, including decomposition analysis, which a lot of people use, I think it's okay. I think it's good, because what you want to do is show that you understood the research question, and then at least here's a way I'm trying to understand it using descriptive methods, right? So I'm okay actually with a thesis having descriptive methods. I don't know what the supervisors here feel about that. But if it's a paper you're writing for a journal, then I think you have to think about it, right? And I hope that you're all getting exposed to all the new stuff that's happening right now with difference and difference, for example, has changed so much in the last 5 years, 6 years. It's amazing, you know, the ideas just progress so much. And then even relation to this country is progressing. All of these methods are moving at very, very quick rates. And so it's actually a challenge, right? You've got to keep on reading papers and seeing what people are using. Even the lecture, you know. But what else? What can you do? You have to stay at the top of the game, right? You've got to publish if you want to survive, you know. So, yeah. Anyway, that's a lecture about methods. I'm okay with descriptive methods for PhDs. I'm not. I don't think that's very. It's very important to have causal. If you have a causal story, nice. You know, helps you later on to get paper, the thesis, essay, chapter published in a good journal. So that's not a bad thing, of course, obviously. But it's not that you have to have it, because you also have limited time to do the thesis, so you have to worry about that too. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. This is very enlightening because I wrote one of my term paper during my master was about resource curse, but the channel is different. The outcome was, my argument that time was a country with abundant natural resource might get trapped in resource curse because that richness might lead the people to be lazy, so that, you know, like Indonesia, we are rich, we just like, we have stick, put it on the land, we can have food, like from cassava. And then it makes the people in the country will be like less hardworking, and that will lead to research curves in the long term. And now you are talking about fiscal capacity that might be the trade-off of having a resource range. This is new discussion for me. But my question is a bit technical. I'm looking at your empirical strategy. Here you are using polity IV or polity 4. Yeah, I think in because we have just had a philosophical lecture and we are discussing on how the economic theory evolved from very traditional, and then now people start to consider, to think about institutions and other things, and then behavioral economic emerge. And here there is a proxy for institution, and you are using polity IV. And what is measured by, well, it's polity 4. What is really measured by that data, actually? Because some of us might want to look into institution when we are doing our dissertation later. Like, it's very difficult to find proxy, how we can distinguish whether a country has good institution or not, how we measure that. And can you tell a bit story on why you choose that data as in your model? That's the first question. And the second one, probably because I'm new, I'm just get into the PhD program, so, and my research experience is still limited. So I really want to hear a story, the process of publishing the paper for you, which part is most challenging, and as experienced scholars, what will be a tips and tricks for us who just jump into research world? So what we should think about, what should we ponder in the if we want to start our research journey. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, the second question, now that you asked me the question, I thought I forgot to tell you something very important about this paper, actually. So, you know, when you get a referee report, so all of you are going to, hopefully at some point, this will happen, if not already, you always get a situation where you have one referee who doesn't like your paper, okay? All right, that's a reality. If you get both referees who like your paper, fantastic. It doesn't happen too often. There's one referee who says, okay, I like the paper, you know, you have to do this and this and this, and there's one referee, I don't really like this paper. Now, the editor, of course, has to make a decision, because one referee saying, no, I don't like the paper, reject the paper. Other referee saying, okay, I think this is okay, and I'll give this paper a chance to resubmit it. You know, you can resubmit the paper. It's a reject, R&R, rejected, resubmit. So the editor is sort of, okay, I think I'll give you a chance because I think we can see the merit of the paper. Often the editor says, no, sorry. There's one referee who doesn't like a paper, that's enough for me. I'm going to reject your paper. That's usually the case. But sometimes the editor does give you a chance. In this case, we had one referee who didn't like the paper, okay? Now then the problem is, you see that when you get that situation, when you have a negative referee report and you have a relatively positive, or at least a constructively positive referee report, often the thing is, you say, what do I do with the negative report? Because I don't have a chance now. This person doesn't like the paper, and the paper will be sent back to the same person anyway, right? Then you think, okay, the editor is already signaling to you that, you know, I think you still have a chance, so why am I getting so pessimistic? So then you look at the negative report, and then you try to think what can convince a referee, but more important, what convince the editor that you try to convince the referee. The editor might say, okay, maybe the referee may not get convinced, but I am getting convinced, you're trying your best. So you have to prepare long, so this paper, the response letters were like 20 pages each time, 20 plus. Because you had all kinds of responses for each comment, and we have produced tables, appendix tables, so each response, the response letters, you were producing everything the referee wanted in the paper, in the letter itself, because we don't want to take a chance. The referee might say, I don't want to read the paper now. I'm going to just reject the paper based on the letter. So that is the big problem. So often what I write the response letter first, then I do the revision. I do whatever the referee asks me to do, and then once I've done that, then I copy and paste and put it in the different parts of the paper, right? And I think that's the best way, you know. I do think it's the best way, because you are actually, all you have to do is satisfy the referees, basically, right? So if you then write the response letter completely addressing each comment as much as you can, right? Sometimes it's difficult, but you try your best. And then once you write the response letter, then you can go back to the paper. And then it's actually not that difficult, because you know what you have to say, right? I find that strategy, in my view, is much more effective in getting a paper published these days. You know, do not rely on the referees reading your paper or the editor reading the paper. You just look at the letter itself, and then they make a decision, right? So that happened with this paper, that the referee reports were negative, one referee, and we spent a lot of time trying to convince more the editor than the referee that the referee might not exactly got the referee comments right, because that also happens, right? So that is an important learning process from this whole experience, and I forgot to mention that, because I do think that's what I spend a lot of time on, right, on the response letters. Now, the other point, you know, about, sorry, the first question was? Oh, yeah. So, you know, so one, that's a really good question, because economists are consumers of data. We don't produce, you know, except if you do your own field surveys, like a lab in the field, mostly we're using data from somebody else, whether it's a Sakana surveys that I was using today, or somebody else's data on institutions. So we are very good in just using data without even thinking about where the data is coming from. So in this case, VDEM is a new database that came very recently. Polity was the one we used to use before, including the paper I mentioned, Asif Johnson Robinson. The VDEM database is a very good database that has all the measures of institution we are looking for. It has institutional measures about property rights. Do countries respect property rights? Is a very important measure of institution, right? Do countries have checks and balances on the executive? Democracy, of course, is there. So this VDEM database was put together by a political scientist in Gothenburg, in Sweden. What this person did is that his person had in each country 4 or 5 experts who were coding the data for each country's history. And so not one person, there were several people, right? So it was pretty rigorous. It was subjective data coding. So I'm asked, like, what do I think about what happened in India between 1980 1990? You know, so maybe that's not that straightforward. But then you're asking experts to code the data on different metrics. And then they do a sophisticated statistical analysis, all the expert reviews, and they then create a single measure for institutional quality, right? And I think that VDEM data, if anybody had to use institutional quality data, I would go to VDEM data. I'm not convinced about other data sets. I've been using a lot of the institutional quality data. Other data sets, the rigor, the checks are not there. You have to be, you know, you don't want a situation where it's one person's view for a country, which you are using. This sometimes happens with Heritage Foundation and some of the other databases. Very subjective data, right? Like, somebody doesn't like a particular country, they give the country very negative score, the democracy, right? So VDEM has been amazing innovation, I think, for political science, but also economics. And increasingly, I find that most of us are using VDEM data. Great thing of VDEM, it goes back 200 years. So I had a paper which I was also thinking of speaking about today on clientelism, because I was told clientelism is a very interesting topic now in Indonesia. So the paper was trying to look at the clientelism's effects on rule of law and on governance. Now, clientelism is a very difficult thing to measure, right? How do I know Indonesia's got more clientelism than India or less? But luckily, VDEM has exactly used the same approach to code countries in terms of clientelism and say, okay, very high clientelism, very low clientelism, obviously changes over time. And it was pretty, the measures were pretty sensible. So we used this data set from VDEM, then looked at clientelism's effects on corruption, rule of law, and so on. We find very negative effects, not surprising. But clientelism is a very, very bad thing, I think, in my view, in a society. But clientelism means that you're favoring somebody and not somebody else, because you're targeting your whatever you're giving, like vote buying, for example, is a classic clientelism strategy. You're buying votes, but offering money to somebody, not to everyone. You can't do that. So that was a nice example of using, where it was very difficult to think of a measure for clientelism. Till we found the way it was in VDEM, and we used that, and then we could, look at what happened with clientelism in different countries in different years, right? So I think we have to be open to data from political science in particular. I trust them more than I trust other economics institutional data, because economists are often, I feel, quite subjective, and they're not so rigorous with qualitative data. Political scientists are very careful with qualitative data, because that's their job, right? So yeah, VDEM. I think if you are thinking of doing a PhD or what, use VDEM, and I would say that you can trust the VDEM data as much as you can trust any other data.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kunal. Very inspiring one. Just not question, but observations. Take away from the referee process and the story that you told us. What I'm observing quite nice about the process is that the first instance of request to have country case study lead to a struggle later on to use more rigorous causal identifications, in which you at the end find the synthetic DID exactly comparing two entities, and the only difference is the exposure to, let's say, the price of oil changes. So in this regard, I interpret that it could be the case that you had a group of referee that quite giving opportunity to and lead the author to go to the good shape of the article at the end of the day by just triggering this kind of thing. So yeah, that's my interpretation on the process. Maybe you can give more insight along the way. And yeah, the coincidence of having this kind of request and the composition in your team who master empirical technique with the recent approach is just a good combination that at the end make the publications went well. And yeah.
Something I want to say, and again for all of you here, that I've never really regretted any time when I had to revise a paper, because whenever I ended up with a paper, it's finally ready for acceptance. I've always felt that actually the paper is much better than when I first wrote the paper. Never felt that the paper's quality has diminished over time or stayed the same. I've always felt that actually the paper is moving up and up, up, up and up. So I always think referees, even when you don't like what they say and they're not, they sometimes make sometimes not the most sensible suggestions, still there's something you learn from that process. So this paper, right? This paper at the beginning did not have case studies. This paper did not have a theoretical framework. This paper did not have robust causal evidence. By the time the paper got accepted, it had a very nice case study. I love this case study, Indonesia, Nigeria. I really like it because it's a great example, right, of two countries in two different continents and similar oil price booms, but very different outcomes on fiscal capacity. Lovely, it's a wonderful case study, right? And case studies are really important because they actually tell you a lot about what's going on, right? So I had a very nice case study, thanks to also the wonderful book that was written earlier about Indonesia, Nigeria, right? So I got that, and then I had this nice new technique, which I didn't know about when I started writing this paper. So at the end of the day, the paper has come out, in my view, much stronger than if I hadn't got those referee comments. What it's supposed to referee, they say, yeah, this is a great paper, go and publish it, publish it, don't worry about anything. Yeah, it would have got accepted, but perhaps it would not have been strong enough. And if it's not strong enough, people will not read the paper, will not cite the paper, it will get forgotten, right? So papers have to be read. It's no point publishing a paper in a journal and then just that's enough. No, people need to write, to engage with your paper. The paper needs to be cited. Like the Assemble Johnson Robinson paper, right? But there are many papers in American Economic Review. I mean, every issue has like 10 papers. Not all these papers get this kind of Google Scholar cites, right? So something in that paper got people interested, right? So the other thing I should say to you, I do think, and I think in economics there's a tendency to write just mechanical papers just to get papers published and do your basic causal identification. I think, I still hope that here in this, in this department, people are encouraged to ask big questions, which is a very big question about Indonesia and so on, right? Because those questions, if you write a paper that answer a big question, the paper will get noticed because the question is important. And then if you do a good job of trying to answer the question, people will cite your paper. So I do think that just getting a paper published, in my view, of course it's important, you have to have publications to survive today in anywhere. But it's also, can I write a paper that actually I said something important in this paper that people will sort of say, okay, this is a really nice thing you did, something that we can see the value of this paper. I think that's also important. So it's not easy to balance all these different things. Writing a paper that people think, oh, it's a nice paper, trying to get it published, you go through the refereeing process and try to make sure that you do everything the referees want you to do. But I think it's important as economists. I think we are getting too narrow, too driven by methods, right? And we're forgetting to ask the big questions. I mean, for example, as I was saying earlier today, that some of the work we've seen on Indonesia, from the Indonesia project in ANU, has been absolutely world-class, right? Not just Indonesia project, but elsewhere too. World-class work on Indonesia, right? They may not have, in today's world, those kind of papers or work is not often recognized because people are trying to publish in these narrow kind of fields. How important that work was to understand Indonesia's economic development process and for policy making, right? So how to balance all these things, not easy. How to balance asking important questions, writing a paper that is meaningful, you feel proud of. I wrote a really good paper that is trying to say something meaningful, and then getting the paper through a good journal. All those things is not easy, but I do think we have to as economists, have to aspire for that. Otherwise, what are we in economics for, right? Is economics like a engineering, or is it a social science, right? So, I mean, very good to hear about what you were saying about the resource curse, because, of course, I would ask you, how would you test this hypothesis that people get lazy? That's a difficult hypothesis to test, but at least you're thinking about it. And maybe you can find an innovative way to test the hypothesis, right? Maybe there are measures out there to see whether people work hard or not work hard, or maybe you can do an experimental method. Maybe you can do a lab in the field, right? Experimental methods in the field, right? So there are many ways you can, your hypothesis is interesting, in my view, difficult to test also, in my view, because whether people work hard or not is unobservable, as you say, right? We can't observe that. But that's a challenge that you're facing. And maybe you might come up with a really nice way to answer the question, if you're going to look at that question, that nobody has thought about, right? So that's how good papers get written, right? I mean, if everything was so straightforward, then how would that happen, right? So I think that's also an example, like your example you provided was an example of why you're asking an important question. You haven't found yet the methods, I think, right? And it would be challenging to think of what method you might use. But if you can, then you have a great thesis or paper, right? So I think that's the way to think about it. Not think, okay, I know synthetic DID. Where do I go and find a problem now? You know, that's not the way to do it, isn't it? Because then, like, you're going to not really able to think of really nice questions with the method that you have learned, right? So yeah, I don't know how much asking the big questions is really important in economics, because that's not what we are seeing. There's been a tendency to move away from the big questions, right, into this very narrow kind of fields. Nowadays, if you're I don't want to use trade theory here, you know, but if you're in a field like public finance, let's say public finance, nobody's a public finance, but you don't want to know anything about trade theory. If you're a trade economist, you want to learn anything about environmental economics, but that's not the way it should be, right? You should know at least a broad sense of what economics is about. So there is this danger that's happening in specializing too much nowadays, you know, and I think we got to, I hope that here the teaching is across the different, you know, yeah, you know. Yeah, so, you know, I think it's important to try and do that, to try to get exposed to as much as possible.
Any more questions? Can I ask a quick questions?
Yeah.
Like, I would like to understand, like, how, I know, like, this been published, and, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, question the results, but, you know, what's the implication that we can take away from this? So, the way I see the theoretical framework that you presented is that the natural resource, the cost of collecting natural resource rents is always higher than the cost of collecting tax. Is it the way we should see it? Like, I think the way the theoretical framework starts is like that. So the relative cost of collecting natural resource rents is lower, right? So, but later on, when we include condition of, you know, institution condition, then it looks that if you have a better check and balance in the institutions, then the relationship between natural resource rents and tax collections becomes complementary. Meanwhile, when it's lower, it becomes substitute. So, okay, we can take it also, of course, that can happen. It's just like it, in the case of, you know, we have a static institutional quality, okay, then it feels like, okay, we're doomed if we're like in a lower condition, and we're super lucky if not. But is it the way we should think of it? So, or like, what kind of policy recommendation, you know, like, okay, in the case that we're in, for example, in a lower quality institution, then what should we do, right? We just have to take it as it is, that it will be substitute from one another between natural resource rent and tax collection revenue, but then it feels like it's a suboptimal. Is it an equilibrium, or is it going to be like getting worse? I would just like to get like what kind of, in real world, what kind of policy recommendation that we can, you know, take away from the results. The second one is that in the case of changes of institutions, so if we think institution is an endogenous outcome, for example, like I think what we face in Indonesia, maybe we have been experiencing a change of institutional quality, then is it possible that we can switch from the condition that, you know, when natural resource rents were complementary to tax collection, which is, for example, back in 1970s Indonesia's, but then when we move to a lower condition of institutional quality, then this relationship switch.
Let's take the first question. This is a really interesting question. So, you know, so three countries out there, okay? One country doesn't have resources. Which countries can we think of in this example? Well, yeah, okay, it's an island state. So, but yeah, Singapore. But then we think of South Korea. South Korea really didn't have any natural resources. In fact, we know the story in South Korea. There wasn't any natural resources. And then, think of Bangladesh. Bangladesh does not have natural resources, right? So when you are in a situation like that and you become independent, like Bangladesh became independent in the 70s, and you don't have resources to use like some of the other countries like Malaysia had, what do? Okay? Then the leadership, of course, has to think about what do we need to do to accumulate capital and so on and so forth. And then, of course, leadership it's important because the leadership has to be long-term, vision and so on, thinking about the future. And there's a very nice book on Bangladesh that said that in Bangladesh, leadership realized very quickly, they don't have resources. They also had a very unfortunate situation. Many of the human capital was because of the independence war. A lot of young people died, and particularly intellectuals died, right? So they were in a human capital-wise in a bad situation, no resources, and the elites there, not just the government, but the elites, decided that they needed to rebuild the country in such a way that there was a civil society movement, the famous Grameen Bank, BRAC, and so there they could have taken a wrong direction. Of course, there were mistakes made in here and there, but generally, Bangladesh is a great success story, right? Because it was so poor when it started out in the 70s, very, very poor, like a basket case. And then it was a climatically vulnerable country with all kinds of problems, climate change, so on. And now look at Bangladesh now. It's moving towards very close. I think it's almost in income status now, doing very well, in many ways, not just growth, but many different ways. So there the elites realized quickly, no resources, very little human capital, very little geographically very difficult environment. What do we do to invest in our people? And then our civil society responded very strongly. Not so much the government, but leadership in civil society, right? So if you look at the Grameen Bank example, Mohammed Yunus comes back from the US, young school teacher, sees the poverty around him. What does he do? He starts Grameen Bank because he thinks that through Grameen Bank, I can get microfinance institutions together. Who are the people in the microfinance institutions? Mostly poor women. He collects them, they form these microfinance groups, and we know the rest is history, right? And that has led to a situation where, if you look at Bangladesh's women's economic empowerment measures or education among women, it's quite remarkable. It's far higher than many of the other countries in the region, South Asia, right? So leadership there made a difference because there was a problem they faced. The leadership could see ahead. That doesn't happen often, right? Now, in spite of other problems because there were military coups and so on, obviously happened there. South Korea also similar, but South Korea has also had an advantage that they also had a fairly authoritarian regime, which was quite far-sighted also, could see ahead. I think that was a big advantage. And then you'll have countries which are resource-rich, where elites essentially behave like what Mansur Olson, the political scientist, calls bandits. So you have bandits out there essentially simply robbing the resource wealth. They come, they rob, somebody else comes in, the military has a coup, those rulers go away, another set of rulers come in, same problem. And if you look at many countries in Africa now, DRC Congo, South Sudan, all these countries, you see this problem. They have resources, they have oil, they have other resources, but this problem that the elites are not long-term, right? So I guess the problem is that, so your question is that how do we build this long-term part? And that's not straightforward. It's like there's no magic out there that says to a leader, okay, look, you got to think about being also called a stationary bandit, right? Not a roving bandit. So think of future, don't think about your current situation, current consumption. Think of future consumption. Not straightforward, right? And actually, if you look around you, there are very few successful countries in this way, right? You can almost count them on your fingers. That's a very sad thing, I have to say, but that's true, right? Very few countries which have succeeded in this kind of way, in this path, right? So I think resources, if we have long-term thinking, and that's kind of what we're trying to see in a different way, right? Political leadership, which is somewhat constrained by what they can do. I think that's possible. Now, if they don't have that, then what? Okay, they don't have that. Then how do you create this leadership? right? Because you can't do it from outside. It has to be internal, right? Sometimes, there are changes in the country when the ruling coalitions change. Sometimes able leaders come in, they grab opportunity. Asmuglu and Robinson call it critical junctures. There's critical junctures in history. The best example often people make is about the Glorious Revolution in England. In England, there was a revolution where against the monarchy, and then there was a set of elites who came in who were commercial elites, and trade was happening and so on. And these elites were very much interested in long-term development, right? This might not happen in England, we don't know, because the argument is France didn't go through that same process. In France, the monarchy was very important and it was a very different process. So it's not, you cannot give a kind of blueprint to a leader and say, this is the blueprint for you to follow. It's to do with history, politics, and look at Indonesia too, right? The history in Indonesia, it's not like this blueprint that was there that the leaders followed, right? So that part of it, I have to say to you, there's no simple answer. Each country has to find its own history, own pathway, right? And generally, of course, we do see bad choices being made by leaders, right? That's the reality, because of the short-termism that's inherent there, right? And that's why the argument often that democracy doesn't really sometimes help. If democracy is not very established in that country, but democracy leads to clientelism, leads to short-termism, and so on. That's another argument you can make in those kind of countries, right? But democracies are very fragile democracies. So I think that's that's one first part of your answer. The second part of your answer is that, so you had strong institutions before, let's say in Indonesia, possibly 1970s, and institutional weakening over time, that can also happen. What does one do in that situation, right? Now, that can happen. Institutions can strengthen or weaken, of course. And you're right, the institutions are endogenous, right? In our paper, we don't really deal with that these checks and balances we're talking about are endogenous, right? And can there be a mechanism by which you can get stronger institutions? So if you look at the literature on this, Acemoglu Robinson's work is the most important, I think. They say that trade makes a big difference. Because when you have trade, then elites understand, especially commercial elites, about the English Revolution, that trade can give you this returns, this rents from exporting. So there are some exogenous factors. Trade is kind of exogenous, I guess, which could lead to this situation when you get this high level equilibrium, right? Maybe export-oriented industrialization in Suharto's time, or in South Korea, or perhaps in Taiwan, maybe China too, I don't know. I'm not sure about China, but certainly South Korea. Maybe those are the things that shift. What you want is the elite's time horizon being lengthened, right? You want the elites to think more about the future than about the present. So I think those are things, but you're right, there's no I think the point is that countries do go through the cycle of strong institutions, perhaps at one point in history, and the institution can get weakened over time. I mean, again, I don't want to use Indonesia too many times here, but if you look at Indonesia's history from 1966 to all the way then to 1996, and I have a paper on this actually. This is a paper I wrote for Hal Hill's, a book that came out for Hal, and because I wanted to write something for Hal, which I thought was not the standard thing that one normally does. And there I made the argument in the case of Indonesia, what happened was that Suharto's time, there was a very strong checks and balances, oil price boom, everything. And then over time, as you get to the mid-1990s, there's a weakening of that because oligarchy capitalism gets stronger, lots of rents in the system. So the weakening of that, under the same ruler, right? So I hope that's not a controversial argument to make here, but essentially the weakening that happened under the same regime, you might say, right? So, and we know what happened as a consequence of that. So, yeah, there's no kind of way that you can, the lesson is very difficult here. But I do think that that there is an argument that if you don't have ways to check that, which perhaps in that time there wasn't, right? Then you have this problem, and of course you have lots of possibilities that you had in that time of crony capitalism, right? So yeah, I mean, I think one could argue that things are maybe it's more robust now than compared to that time period in Indonesia. I don't know. Difficult to say.
I was just asking that because I think it's quite common. I mean, this is something that is happening everywhere in the world, not only in Indonesia or developing countries, but also in like more developed economies or developed democracies, that these checks and balance have been weakening. Like it's not only Indonesia's problem, I think. Like even in the U.S., I think everyone knows like what they also face problem in terms of having a good check and balance towards their leaders. So I think perhaps it makes it even harder for because maybe leaders become more populist, prone to populism. So it becomes even more costly for them to increase tax collection and easier for them to get revenue from other than tax collection. So I was just thinking this is not only about Indonesia, but like I think this is a problem that kind of being faced by all over the world, having this social dynamics that creates more pressure for populism, less check and balance, and once you are part of the leadership, it's hard for any leader to become long-term visionary. Like I think that's also what's important in your argument, right? We need leaders that not only think about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but more than that. Just for discussion. But even right-wing populism also can reduce check and balance, right? Change to authoritarian. Right, great. Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. Okay, maybe one more last question, if any. No? One more last question. We cannot take also from the one from YouTube, right? Because I don't think we can. Mas Eko nggak bisa ya? Yang dari YouTube tuh nggak mungkin ya? Kalau ada pertanyaan. Is there any comments or questions from YouTube? Just to quickly check so we do not ignore the other side of the world. Oh, there's one. Okay. Okay, currently. Most are here. Okay, so if not, then I think let's give a round of applause to Professor Kunal Sen. Thank you so much. Before we close, we have a token of appreciation will be given by our head of graduate program. Mana itu? Oh, mana mbaknya? Sebentar. You met Bu Dia? Oke. Ibu Dia.